Hi everyone, happy Saturday. Apologies for the delay in my recording and uploading of this video. I wanted to make sure that I give you a thorough review of the week, of what happened. As you know by now, we are really going at a fast pace, but really covering a lot of information, a lot of valuable information. So, again, similar to last weekend, I'm just giving you a quick overview of what we covered. During last week so that you can refresh your memory. I'm also thinking of different ways of doing these reviews. Maybe instead of doing the videos, just writing a quick one-page sheet with what we reviewed, because I do that anyway. Like I keep all of my notes. I'm old school like that. But that's something that we can discuss next week and discuss it together. As you know, by now I'm very participatory in the way that I do things, and we will see how things go. But in any case, what we did last week, beginning on Tuesday, is that we continued reviewing American Indian law and policy. We began with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 to the present. Some cases that I want you to pay attention to in that particular part of American Indian law and policy is, of course, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. That one is very important. Termination and relocation of the 1950s and 60s, very important. It continues to have reverberations in American Indian society. Termination, of course, that's the ever-present boogeyman of tribal nations, I would say, because the federal government has plenary power over tribal nations. That means that at any point, Congress can decide actually if they will terminate a tribe. Of course, that hasn't happened since the 1960s, and tribes really fought to keep their federal recognition, but it's something that could happen. So that's something that needs to change, in my opinion, when it comes to American Indian law and policy. Like there's something that needs to be encoded that protects tribes from that kind of arbitrary action. The other one is the self-determination era, which began in the 1970s to the present. Self-determination era really refers to the fact that tribal nations, after that point, they were able to take more control of what they were doing. They were able to hire their own lawyers, for example, to fight their own cases. Although I will say that I've heard some stories, and mind you, this is just review, and what I'm about to tell you right now is not something that I told you in class last week, but just another anecdote is that I've heard from tribal nations that I've interacted with during my PhD and also other consultant work that I've done, is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has actually fired lawyers working for tribes that are too effective. If those lawyers are too effective in protecting the rights of that particular tribe, the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, can actually turn around and fire them, because it's a very paternalistic way in which the United States federal government has purview over the tribal nations. Now, self-determination era, there have been policies that have been beneficial to tribal nations, but there's also been cases that have not been beneficial for tribal nations. Okay, so the beneficial policies that I wanted you to keep in mind are ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, essentially. That one is from 1990. ICWA is from 1978. Okay, we also have Oliphant, which I told you about. This was a very, very pervasive, nefarious Supreme Court case, Oliphant versus Suquamish, through which essentially through that case, the Supreme Court said that tribal nations do not have the authority to prosecute non-Indians who commit crimes within Native American reservations. Okay, very, very problematic. And when you look at these policies, again, that's why I spent 2 days essentially looking at these policies, laws and policies with you, is that just because they're old doesn't mean that they're not in effect or they're not affecting tribal nations today. Because in Oliphant, when you look at the opinion, at the United States Supreme Court opinion, it says in there that one of the reasons why tribal nations do not have the authority to prosecute non-Indians who commit crimes in the reservation is because, quote unquote, tribal nations gave up that authority in 1831, when essentially through Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, when they accepted the Supreme Court opinion that tribal nations were domestic dependent nations, still independent, but under the purview and under the purview of Congress. I was going to say at the sufferance of Congress, but that's another case. It still falls into the into that general view. So that's American Indian law and policy, the second part. Okay, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the discussion post, and we can discuss them next week, as we did this past week. Next, the next thing that we reviewed was the pueblos. Okay, in my opinion, Trimble was a bit scattered in the way that he explained the pueblos. It's not necessarily a criticism, it's just an observation. I understand why he was scattered, because there's a lot of pueblos in New Mexico, and also in Arizona. Well, with the Zunis and the Hopis being what Trimble calls the Pueblo frontier, because they are far away, and they have different religious activities, for example, and Trimble attributed those differences to the fact that the Hopi, for example, they're in the high desert and they depend on the rain, so they have to have a very strict ceremonial cycle that emphasizes praying to the cloud people so that it rains, because they depend on seasonal springs to have their gardens and plant their corn and the squash and the beans. And the pueblos in New Mexico, which are mostly scattered along the Rio Grande area, or where there's rivers and creeks, it's different. It's a different type of ceremonial cycle that they have, but still very, very important and very very integral to Pueblo life and who they are. But the thing that I wanted you to pay attention to is the description of Juan de Oñate. I mentioned that he got permission to go and settle New Mexico in the late 1500s. There was a Pueblo revolt, not to be confused with the Pueblo revolt of 1680. And the result of that rebellion was that he quashed it. Juan de Oñate quashed it, and essentially he ordered men to be maimed, essentially, like they would cut a foot off. Why did he do that to that extreme? Who knows? But that's you can see throughout history that's extreme reactions are usually what takes place when there's rebellions, when there's Indian rebellions. The next thing that I wanted you to keep in mind is the actual historical Pueblo revolt of 1680. As we read, when we read the chapter on the Navajos actually helped the Pueblos in that rebellion, or the Pueblo revolt of 1680. That still didn't keep the Spaniards away. As we saw in the book, the Spaniards came back in 1692, so 12 years later. But the Pueblos actually were able to keep the missionaries at bay, mostly. Like with the Hopis, for example, Trimble says that with the Hopis, there weren't any more missionaries coming to Hopi land until the 1890s, and by that point, it's already part of the United States. Okay. Now, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the pueblos were displaced from their original locations. Okay, they still remained in an area similar to where they were originally, but a lot of them, the vast majority of them, actually were displaced. And Trimble says that by 1700, only 6 pueblos remained in their original locations. Pueblo and Zuni being 2 of them. Okay, so keep that in mind. I did ask you one of those questions for the quiz, so you probably have that in your notes. Just looking at my notes here. Also keep in mind that the big picture of how things were changing in the 1800s, right? So in 1821, up to 1821, it was this area was part of New Spain. Then the Spanish Empire collapsed in 1821, and this area became Mexico. Then the United States had the war with Mexico for more land, because the United States wanted to spread from the East Coast to the West Coast. It's part of Manifest Destiny. I don't think that I mentioned that in my lecture last week, but it's part of Manifest Destiny. Again, this is only a review, so if you notice that I'm telling you new things, it's because that's how my brain works. But I'm very conscious of what I told you last week, and that's what we're reviewing now. Okay. So in 1848, there was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded a lot of the land that we're at, a big chunk of land. I showed you a map last week, to the United States. In 1853, there was the Gadsden Purchase to give another slice of what now is southern Arizona to the United States. Okay, and then after that, the Pueblos and the Navajos, and pretty much every single tribal nation that we know that is in New Mexico and Arizona today, they had to contend with the laws and policies of the United States. Okay, when it comes to land, Trimble does say that that the United States had a bit of the United States treated the Pueblos differently than other Indians because they were more quote unquote civilized, probably. So they weren't put in reservations. That's why they're not called reservations. They're called pueblos. Okay, the Hopis are different. Okay, but I'm talking about the pueblos in New Mexico that we see today, and what he's saying is that what the United States did recognize was the Spanish land grants that the Spaniards did with the pueblos. Okay, it's really backwards, and really when we're talking about social justice, for example, again, it's you turn justice in its head because you're talking about land being granted to people who already own the land to begin with. So how can you do that? It's like you take away that land from them and then you give it to them again. But in any case, in 1958, the United States recognized the Spanish land grants from when the Kingdom of Spain was reigning over the region. So again, after 1848 and 1853, it was the laws and policies of the United States, generally speaking, that applied to the pueblos. Okay, that means reservations for the Hopi. Okay, Hopi Reservation was established in 1882. Keep in mind, the Navajo Reservation was established in 1868. Okay, we are looking at two chapters separately, the chapter in the Pueblos, on the Pueblos, and the chapter on the Navajos. But in reality, when you look at the historical continuum, they were all affected similarly. Okay, and that means assimilation tactics, like the boarding schools, the Allotment Act, the General Allotment Act of 1887, the missionaries, like Trimble says, that in the late 1800s, essentially what happened was that the United States worked with Christian denominations, and they divvied up the reservations and assigned certain Christian denominations to go and establish missions in reservations. Okay, some reservations got the Lutherans, for example, others got the Mennonites, and so on. Okay, also Mormons were prevalent. So you see that, and you also see, I mentioned that in the late 1800s there were 19 Hopi men that were imprisoned in Alcatraz for a year because they were opposing sending their children to boarding schools, to faraway boarding schools. In the Navajo chapter, you also see that they talk about one man who was also imprisoned for a year. Trimble doesn't say where he was imprisoned, but he was. It makes me believe that was the practice. That was the general policy of the United States, that anyone who opposed, any parent that opposed, male parent, because it was men who notice that they weren't talking about imprisoning women, right? So any father that would oppose having their children taken to faraway boarding schools got imprisoned for a year. Okay, so then the continuum continues, right? Let's not forget, before moving on to the 1900s, about the Hopi split. That's something that I spent some time talking to you about. I mean, really, what you have to keep in mind is that once the United States took over this area, I mean, it's essentially the kind of foreign intervention that you see today is the same kind of foreign intervention that they did with the Hopis and the Navajos. Okay, and that caused problems. It caused intra-tribal tensions, and that's where you see the friendlies versus the hostiles with the Hopis, or you see the progressives versus the conservatives, generally speaking. So you see this clear split. Of course, it's not black and white, and there are some quotes that Trimble has in the book where he alludes to that, and he says, well, like you can't be 100% a conservative, and you can't be 100% a progressive. But with the Navajo Hopi split, it's a continuum that has continued, because in 1935 their tribal council was established, and the tribal council wasn't established with the consent of the Hopis. The tribal council was established between the United States and some powerful Hopis that had a lot to gain from the creation of the tribal council. And as Trimble says, by 1992, only 2 villages were represented by the tribal council. I can't speak for the Hopis, but it tells you about the tensions that are created by United States Hopi relations. Okay, that's an example that I mentioned. I also mentioned the other pueblos, like the Tigua Pueblo, for example. That was a case study that Trimble had. Pay attention to that. I didn't quiz you on that, but it's important to see how each pueblo reacted to the intervention and what they did and how they were affected by different realities. Like the Tigua Pueblo, they ended up in the El Paso area, and that's part of Texas. And Texas has its own rules. And what happened with that pueblo is that first they were state recognized, and then finally they gained federal recognition. There's also the example of the Taos Pueblo and the Blue Lake. So remember about the Blue Lake and what the Blue Lake means to the Taos Pueblo people. They fought for that Blue Lake. Okay, so and then in the 1950s and 60s, mining activities came to the pueblos. That's something that I'm planning to begin the class on Tuesday, really having a discussion about what mining activities have brought to the pueblos, because there's a clear tension there, and mind you, we see that tension everywhere. It's not unique to the pueblos or the Navajos or anyone else, but it's that kind of development is very destructive. It usually pollutes groundwater, it pollutes rivers, but it brings development. It brings more money for the pueblos and the Navajos and the Hopis, but at what cost? And you see that. You see that tension between the ones who want quote unquote progress, like economic progress, and those who do not want that, because they see that what good is it for your tribe if you are getting, I don't know, $30 million a year from this mining company that is mining in your territory, if your water is polluted, if you are having to breathe toxic dust, toxic uranium dust, right? Again, we didn't discuss this about the mining part last week in depth. I just want you to know, keep an eye out for the Black Mesa mine, because that's really the overlap between the Hopis and the Navajos, okay? And in the opinion of some people, the Black Mesa mine, it's a coal mining operation, essentially. That is essentially what led to the tragedy of Big Mountain, when the Navajos were essentially told to leave and move someplace else in the 1970s. Okay, so this video is getting long. Actually, I didn't think that I was going to talk for this long. I'm going to talk about the Navajos really quickly. Okay, so the Navajos, keep in mind, prior to the 1850s, they were nomads. And they had areas where they went in the winter, and they had areas where they went in the summer. But they had a reputation of raiding the Pueblos and the Europeans. So they would raid the Spaniards, and later they began raiding the Euro-Americans. But in the 1850s and 60s, of course, remember, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Gadsden Purchase, the United States Army began devising a scheme to essentially bring the Navajos to heel. And that really culminated in 1864, where the U.S. Army captured thousands of Navajos. I've seen some accounts of around 9,000 Navajos, women, children, elderly, men. They were all rounded up and they were force marched from the area where their reservation is at now to Fort Sumner in Bosque Redondo. I show you that map. A lot of Navajos died during that long walk, and a lot of Navajos also died when they were imprisoned in that reservation, in the Fort Sumner reservation, because the water quality, it wasn't good. It was very alkaline water. Crops weren't growing. And this is northern New Mexico. This is like the eastern side, but still northern New Mexico. It snows there, and it's dry, so they suffered. The Navajos did suffer a lot. There's some harrowing accounts of what happened. But in 1868, some Navajo leaders got together with the United States government, and they devised a treaty. They worked on the treaty, and essentially it was through that treaty of 1868 that the Navajo reservation was created. So again, think about this when we're talking about the Navajo Hopi Land Settlement Act of 1974. It begins really that issue begins in the 1800s, because you have the Navajo reservation being established in 1868, and the Hopi reservation was established in 1882. But the Hopis say they've been there all along, and it's true. The Hopis actually have been there for at least 2,500 years in their mesas, and they're not going to move. So that's a cat hair, I think, in my pen. So keep that in mind, okay? So once the reservation was established, it was expanded several times by executive order to the size of their reservation today. The reservation is large. It's actually the largest reservation, Indian reservation in the United States today. It encompasses 3 states: New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And they have the 4 sacred mountains, of course, which I'm not going to discuss because I'm trying to make this video less than 30 minutes, and we're already at 27 minutes, close to 28. Again, as I said earlier, at that point, the Navajos were subject to American Indian law and policy. So boarding schools, General Allotment Act, all of those policies, 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, they applied to the Navajo people. Okay. So also remember the Navajo sheep stock reduction of the 1930s. I'm jumping far ahead now. Very important. By that point, by the 1930s, the Navajos were actually doing quite well. They had a lot of sheep and everything, but the United States government, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, essentially came up with this scheme to reduce and cull the Navajo sheep, because they were saying that the sheep were overgrazing and degrading the territory in the terrain, and that could lead to a lot of silt runoff into the Colorado River, which could eventually clog the Hoover Dam, which had been built in the 1920s. The Navajo, or the sheep reduction scheme, proved very devastating for the Navajo economy and spiritual life, because by that point the Navajos had developed a very spiritual relationship with the sheep. Okay. But then they rebounded. Okay, the Navajos, they do have a reputation for being very, very they adapt. They adapt, but also they keep themselves grounded in their culture. Okay, so then we have the Navajo code talkers of World War II. So yes, they were speaking Navajo, but they actually created their own code in Navajo. Okay, I don't think that Trimble does a good job. If you like the videos that Wally Brown does, I can post some more, because he has some videos about the Navajo code talkers, and of course it's his word, and he's a Navajo elder. So let me know next week about that. Again, mining operations came to Navajo in the 1960s. So we have the Black Mesa mine that began in 1966. And we finish essentially with the Navajo Hopi split, that land split that happened, and really what led to that was the Healing versus Jones case, where it was this rectangle of land. There was the Hopi reservation, and in Healing versus Jones, the court said that both the Hopis and the Navajos had a right to that land, essentially. But in 1974, I mean, the tensions continued, and in 1974, there was the Navajo Hopi Land Settlement Act of 1974, and essentially the Hopis that lived in that area were ordered to go to the reservation side, and the Navajos that lived in the Big Mountain area, which is part of the present day Hopi reservation. So the Navajos that lived in the Big Mountain area were forced to move from there to somewhere else. Okay, that proved very devastating. Okay, so I ended the lecture there last week. Maybe we can review it some more, the Navajo Hopi Land Settlement Act and the repercussions of that. I also want to spend some more time talking about the devastation of the mines. There's a lot of abandoned uranium mines in that area, and there's a lot of cancers that have emerged both in the Pueblos and in the Navajos. But I'm gonna close this video. We're at 32 minutes and 28 seconds. Have a good weekend. I'm also thinking about relaxing. I'm looking forward to the storms. Apparently we're under a severe thunderstorm watch. So watch yourselves out there. Have some fun. And I will see you on Tuesday. Thank you.